History tells you the Great War began with an assassination, but the truth is far more dangerous. The world's biggest empires went to war because their finances were already falling apart. What if the version of World War you were taught barely grazed the real cause? Most people point to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as the spark that lit the fuse. But that explanation is like saying the Titanic went down simply because it hit an iceberg. The event mattered, but the ship was already doomed. Beneath the headlines and heroics was a far more dangerous truth. Europe's biggest empires were already drowning in debt before the first gunshot echoed in Sarajevo. The war didn't begin over a murder. It erupted because the great powers needed a way out of a financial crisis they had quietly created for themselves. The roots reach back to the mid-1800s, when European nations discovered a shortcut to empire. You didn't need to conquer new territory slowly. You could borrow colossal sums and accelerate expansion overnight. Britain pioneered this habit, financing railroads across India, building naval stations everywhere from Gibraltar to Singapore, and maintaining a military machine unmatched anywhere on Earth. As long as the empire grew, the math worked. But by 1914, Britain owed more than $650 million, a staggering obligation sustained only by constant borrowing and continuous territorial growth. France, Germany, and Russia followed the same script. What they thought was a contest for global influence was really a contest of who could juggle the most debt. It mirrored a familiar modern pattern. When your neighbor buys a bigger house, then another neighbor buys 2 houses, you feel compelled to compete. Except in this case, the houses were battleships, armies, colonies, and railroads stretching across continents. Germany was the most dramatic example. Under Kaiser Wilhelm, Berlin borrowed aggressively to challenge British sea power and carve out its own colonial domain. Each new project was justified with the assumption that future spoils would pay the bill. It was the same delusion that fueled the 2008 housing market. Rising assets would magically cover rising debts. If you want to see how bad it could get, look at the Ottoman Empire. By 1875, they defaulted with debts so massive that more than half their annual income went to interest payments alone. European creditors responded by taking over Turkish tax collection through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. A 3-continent empire was effectively run by foreign bankers. This wasn't diplomacy. It was financial colonization. By the early 1900s, Europe formalized this system. Alliances were no longer just military pacts. They were financial contracts requiring nations to guarantee one another's borrowing. Every empire was locked into a cycle. Expansion required debt. Debt required expansion. The numbers no longer added up. Something had to break. War provided the perfect escape hatch. Victory meant access to enemy resources. Mobilization allowed governments to borrow sums they never could have justified in peace. And conflict gave struggling nations a chance to reorganize their entire financial systems under the excuse of national emergency. By 1916, the financial realities became impossible to ignore. Britain wasn't just paying for its own military. It was covering the expenses of Italy, Russia, and nearly 2/3 of France's war spending. One empire was financing an entire alliance. How? Through a dense web of banking relationships stretching across London and New York. This is where J.P. Morgan Jr. enters the picture. 2 years before America officially joined the war, Morgan assembled a syndicate of over 2,000 U.S. banks to loan $500 million to Britain and France. But the loan came with strings. Every Allied munitions purchase had to pass through Morgan's firm. Foreign armies were essentially shopping for weapons in America under the supervision of an American banker. As the war intensified, interest rates climbed. Borrowing became more expensive, making territorial conquest not just strategic, but mathematically necessary. Nations needed new revenue streams to avoid collapse. Germany printed money to cover interest payments. France and Russia pledged their gold reserves to secure support. Everyone was spiraling. When the United States finally entered the conflict in 1917, it wasn't because diplomacy failed. It was because American banks had invested so heavily in the Allied cause that a British or French defeat would have detonated the U.S. financial system. By 1918, America had transformed from a debtor nation to the world's largest creditor, and European empires were dependent on Washington for survival. The war didn't end with peace. It ended with paperwork. Post-war treaties created a circular debt loop. American banks loaned money to Germany. Germany used those funds to pay reparations to Britain and France, and Britain and France used that money to repay the United States. This arrangement lasted almost a century. Germany's final World War I payment was made in 2010. What we call World War I was not simply a geopolitical conflict. It was a massive, global debt restructuring disguised as war. Empires marched millions of soldiers to their deaths not only for territory or pride, but to service financial obligations that had spiraled beyond control. The true victors were not governments or generals. They were the bankers who designed a system where war became profitable and peace became unaffordable.